This cyberpunk disaster, starring Keanu Reeves, hides a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, from script deliveries left on doorsteps to naked sermons cut for being too offensive, plus a cybernetic dolphin that somehow defeats Dolph Lundgren in the film's wildest moment. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Johnny Mnemonic. The script was literally dumped on Keanu's doorstep. Most actors receive scripts through their agents or managers in carefully orchestrated meetings. But Keanu Reeves got his copy of Johnny Mnemonic in the most unconventional way possible. According to industry rumors that have persisted for decades, someone literally dumped the screenplay on the doorstep of his house, leaving it there like a mysterious package waiting to be discovered. This wasn't some random act of vandalism or a mistake by a confused delivery person. The script drop was apparently a deliberate tactic by the filmmakers who were desperately trying to get Reeves interested in their cyberpunk project. At the time, Hollywood was still a much more traditional industry where scripts moved through established channels, making this doorstep delivery method almost unheard of in the mid-1990s. The unconventional approach worked exactly as intended. Rather than being annoyed or confused by finding a screenplay on his doorstep, Reeves was genuinely intrigued by both the unusual delivery method and the content of the script itself. The mystery and boldness of the gesture apparently caught his attention in a way that a standard agent submission might not have accomplished. This guerrilla marketing approach proved to be the key to landing one of Hollywood's rising action stars for their ambitious adaptation of William Gibson's cyberpunk short story. Reeves had just completed filming Speed, which would become a massive hit in 1994, making him an extremely valuable actor to attach to any project. The doorstep delivery story has become part of Johnny Mnemonic's production legend, representing the kind of creative desperation and outside-the-box thinking that characterized the entire troubled production. While some details of the story remain unverified, multiple sources have referenced this unusual recruitment method over the years, suggesting that sometimes the most unconventional approaches can yield the most unexpected results in Hollywood's unpredictable landscape. Accidental dyslexia reference matches Keanu's real condition. In one of the most eerily coincidental moments in Johnny Mnemonic, the film accidentally referenced a real condition that Keanu Reeves actually lives with every day. During an early scene where Johnny passes through airport security, his brain implant is detected by the scanning equipment, but the system misidentifies the cybernetic device as an anti-dyslexia treatment implant, rather than recognizing it as the dangerous data storage unit it actually is. This moment serves as clever misdirection in the plot, allowing Johnny to pass through security without raising suspicions about his true mission as a data courier. The security scanner essentially provides him with the perfect cover story, suggesting to anyone monitoring the system that he's simply someone who has received medical treatment for a learning disability rather than a high-tech smuggler carrying stolen corporate secrets in his brain. What makes this scene genuinely remarkable is that Keanu Reeves actually does suffer from dyslexia in real life, a fact that wasn't widely known by the general public when the film was released in 1995. Reeves has been open about his struggles with the learning disorder throughout his life, describing how it affected his education and early career. He's mentioned in interviews that reading scripts and memorizing lines required extra effort and different techniques compared to other actors. The screenplay writers, including William Gibson himself, apparently had no knowledge of Reeves's personal condition when they included this specific detail in the script. The anti-dyslexia implant reference was simply meant to be a plausible-sounding medical device that would fool security systems in their futuristic world. The fact that this fictional cover story happened to match the star's actual neurological condition creates an almost supernatural connection between the actor and his character, adding an unintended layer of authenticity to Johnny's struggle with technology and memory throughout the film. Budget explode from $1.5 million to $28 million. Johnny Mnemonic represents one of Hollywood's most dramatic examples of how a project can spiral completely out of control financially, transforming from a modest art house experiment into a massive studio production. Director Robert Longo and writer William Gibson originally envisioned their cyberpunk adaptation as an intimate, low-budget film that would cost around $1.5 million to produce, similar to the kind of experimental cinema that emerged from independent filmmakers in the 1980s and early 1990s. The irony of the situation became painfully clear to Longo, who later explained the bizarre logic of Hollywood financing in his own words. He commented that the project started out as an arty $1.5 million movie, and it became a $30 million movie because we couldn't get $1.5 million. This statement perfectly captures the backwards nature of studio decision-making, where executives were apparently more willing to risk enormous sums of money than to invest a relatively small amount in an unconventional artistic vision. Longo had initially wanted to create something closer to Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville, a black-and-white science fiction film made in 1965 that achieved its futuristic atmosphere through creative cinematography and minimal special effects rather than expensive production design. His original concept would have relied on artistic vision and innovative filmmaking techniques rather than costly digital effects and elaborate sets. When the small-budget approach failed to attract investors, Sony Pictures eventually stepped in with major studio backing, but their involvement came with significant strings attached. The studio wanted a mainstream blockbuster that could compete with other big-budget science fiction films, which meant expensive special effects, major stars, elaborate sets, and all the costly elements that Longo had originally hoped to avoid. This transformation fundamentally changed the nature of the project from an experimental art film into a commercial enterprise with enormous financial pressures and studio expectations. Dolph Lundgren's naked religious sermon was cut. One of the most bizarre scenes ever filmed for Johnny Mnemonic never made it to theaters, and it involved Dolph Lundgren delivering a passionate religious sermon while completely naked. The Swedish action star, who played the cybernetic assassin known as the Street Preacher, had originally been given a much more extensive role that included a lengthy monologue exploring the philosophical themes of the film in ways that audiences never got to experience. According to William Gibson, who wrote the screenplay, Lundgren's character was supposed to deliver a detailed sermon about transhumanism, which is the belief that humans can and should enhance themselves through technology to transcend their biological limitations. This speech would have provided crucial background information about the street preacher's motivations and his religious justifications for pursuing Johnny throughout the film, explaining why a cyborg assassin would present himself as a man of faith. The scene was actually filmed with Lundgren performing the entire monologue without any clothing, which would have created a striking visual contrast between his heavily modified cybernetic body and his vulnerable human state. This artistic choice was intended to emphasize the themes of technology versus humanity that run throughout Gibson's cyberpunk fiction, showing how the character had literally stripped away both his clothes and his original biological form in pursuit of his twisted spiritual beliefs. However, studio executives became concerned that the combination of nudity and religious content would create serious problems with various faith-based organizations and conservative groups who might organize boycotts or protests against the film. Gibson explained that the decision to cut the scene came from fears of offending religious audiences, despite the fact that the monologue was meant to explore serious philosophical questions rather than mock or attack any particular belief system. The removal of this scene significantly reduced Lundgren's screen time and eliminated much of the character development that would have made the street preacher a more complex and interesting antagonist. Val Kilmer left to play Batman instead. Johnny Mnemonic could have been a completely different film if Val Kilmer hadn't received one of the most lucrative phone calls of his career during pre-production. The Top Gun star was originally cast as Johnny, the cybernetic data courier, and had already committed to the project when Warner Brothers came calling with an offer that was simply too good to refuse. They wanted him to replace Michael Keaton as Batman in Joel Schumacher's upcoming Batman Forever, and the financial terms were substantially better than what the smaller Johnny Mnemonic production could offer. Kilmer's departure created a major crisis for director Robert Longo and the production team, who were already struggling to secure financing and maintain their artistic vision while dealing with studio pressures. The film was entering the pre-production phase in 1993 when Kilmer unexpectedly withdrew from the project, leaving them scrambling to find a replacement lead actor who could carry their ambitious cyberpunk adaptation. According to reports from the production, Kilmer's exit was actually something of a relief for director Robert Longo, who had already been experiencing creative conflicts with the actor over how the character of Johnny should be portrayed. The two had been fighting over various aspects of the characterization, and Longo was finding it difficult to work with Kilmer's vision for the role, which apparently differed significantly from what the director and William Gibson had originally envisioned. When Keanu Reeves stepped in to replace Kilmer, the change brought both advantages and new challenges to the production. Reeves was already familiar with Robert Longo's artistic work and was a genuine fan of William Gibson's cyberpunk fiction, which meant he understood the source material on a deeper level than his predecessor might have. Additionally, Reeves's Canadian nationality opened up new financial opportunities for the production, including Canadian tax incentives that helped offset some of the budget challenges they were facing during the complicated development process. The cybernetic dolphin Jones was addicted to heroin. One of the darkest and most disturbing aspects of Jones, the cybernetic dolphin's backstory, was completely removed from the final version of Johnny Mnemonic, leaving audiences unaware of the tragic circumstances that led to his current situation. In William Gibson's original short story and the initial screenplay drafts, Jones wasn't just a retired military asset living peacefully with the low-techs, but rather a damaged veteran struggling with a serious drug addiction that had been deliberately inflicted upon him by his former handlers. The United States Navy had intentionally gotten Jones addicted to heroin as a method of ensuring his loyalty and compliance during his years of military service. This cruel practice was designed to make the highly intelligent dolphin completely dependent on his human operators, who controlled his access to the drugs he needed to function. The military reasoning was that an addicted dolphin would never attempt to escape or refuse orders, since doing so would mean losing access to the substances his body now required. In the original story, when Johnny and his bodyguard Molly Millions needed Jones to help decrypt the data locked in Johnny's brain, they had to negotiate with the dolphin using his addiction as leverage. Molly would trade Jones a batch of heroin in exchange for his assistance in finding the password that could save Johnny's life. This transaction highlighted the exploitation that Jones had suffered and continued to endure, even after his supposed retirement from military service. The film version eliminated all references to Jones's drug dependency, instead presenting him simply as a helpful former Navy dolphin who willingly assists the protagonists. While this change made the character more family-friendly and avoided the disturbing implications of military animal abuse, it also removed much of the social commentary that Gibson had embedded in his original cyberpunk story about how institutions exploit and damage the beings they claim to protect. Bono was considered for the street preacher role during the early development stages of Johnny Mnemonic. The filmmakers had their sights set on one of the most unexpected casting choices imaginable for the role of the cybernetic assassin known as the street preacher. Bono, the lead singer of the Irish rock band U2, was actually in serious talks to play the film's primary antagonist, a role that would have required him to portray a heavily modified cyborg who hunts down the main character throughout the movie. This casting consideration reveals just how different the original vision for Johnny Mnemonic was compared to the final product that audiences eventually saw in theaters. Having Bono play a murderous religious fanatic would have brought an entirely different energy and tone to the character, likely emphasizing the philosophical and spiritual themes that William Gibson had woven throughout his cyberpunk fiction, rather than focusing purely on physical intimidation and action sequences. The U2 frontman was known for his passionate stage presence and his outspoken views on religion, politics, and social justice, which would have made him an intriguing choice for a character who represents the dark side of technological enhancement and spiritual extremism. His natural charisma and ability to command attention could have created a street preacher who was genuinely persuasive and terrifying in his beliefs rather than simply being a physical threat to the protagonists. Ultimately, the negotiations with Bono fell through for reasons that have never been fully explained, and the role eventually went to Dolph Lundgren, who brought a completely different interpretation to the character. While Lundgren's imposing physical presence and action movie background made him a more conventional choice for a cyberpunk villain, it's fascinating to imagine how Bono's version of the street preacher might have changed the entire tone and approach of the film, potentially creating something closer to the artistic vision that director Robert Longo originally had in mind. Gibson hated his own film adaptation. William Gibson experienced one of the most frustrating situations any writer can face when he watched the final version of Johnny Mnemonic and barely recognized his own work. Despite receiving sole screenwriting credit on the film, Gibson has spent decades publicly expressing his disappointment with what the studio system did to his carefully crafted screenplay, insisting that the movie audiences saw was fundamentally different from what he had originally written. Gibson's dissatisfaction wasn't just about minor changes or typical Hollywood tweaks to his script. He felt that the entire tone and approach of his screenplay had been altered during production, transforming what he and director Robert Longo had originally envisioned as an ironic art house film into a straightforward action movie. According to Gibson, his original script was full of dark humor and satirical elements that would have given the cyberpunk story a much different feel than the serious, effects-heavy blockbuster that Sony ultimately released. The legendary science fiction author has been remarkably candid about his frustration with the adaptation process, explaining in interviews that the producers re-edited the film to make it more mainstream and commercially appealing. This reworking apparently stripped away much of the subtlety and intelligence that Gibson had built into his screenplay, replacing complex themes and character development with conventional chase sequences and explosion-heavy action scenes. Gibson's experience with Johnny Mnemonic became a cautionary tale about what happens when visionary writers encounter the Hollywood machine. He has described watching the final film as seeing his work filtered through multiple layers of studio interference and commercial considerations, resulting in a product that bore his name but no longer reflected his artistic intentions. The author's public criticism of his own credited work highlights the ongoing tension between creative vision and commercial demands that continues to plague many film adaptations of literary works. Sony created unprecedented corporate synergy. Johnny Mnemonic became Sony's grand experiment in corporate cross-promotion, representing what the entertainment giant proudly described as an unprecedented level of synergy between its various business divisions. The company treated the cyberpunk film as a showcase for how a modern media conglomerate could maximize profits by coordinating releases across multiple platforms and subsidiaries, creating what they hoped would be a multimedia entertainment experience that generated revenue from every possible angle. The orchestrated launch involved three major Sony divisions working together in ways that were relatively uncommon in the entertainment industry during the mid-1990s. Sony Pictures handled the theatrical release of the film itself, while their music subsidiary Columbia Records simultaneously released the soundtrack album featuring industrial and electronic artists who perfectly matched the movie's futuristic aesthetic. Meanwhile, Sony Imageworks, the company's digital effects division, developed and published a CD-ROM video game version that was released for DOS, Mac, and Windows 3.x operating systems. This coordinated approach allowed Sony to promote each product while simultaneously advertising the others, creating a marketing loop where fans of the movie might buy the soundtrack and the video game, while gamers might be drawn to see the film and purchase the music. The strategy was particularly ambitious for its time, as multimedia tie-ins were still relatively rare, and the technology for creating interactive entertainment was just becoming sophisticated enough to support full-motion video games based on major motion pictures. Sony executives were so proud of their synergistic approach that they used Johnny Mnemonic as a case study for future projects, demonstrating how large corporations could leverage their various entertainment properties to create multiple revenue streams from a single creative concept. The company even promoted the film with an innovative online marketing campaign, recognizing early on the potential for reaching their target demographic through internet advertising and digital promotional tools. A completed Sega CD game was never released. In one of the most frustrating examples of corporate decision-making in video game history, a fully completed version of Johnny Mnemonic for the Sega CD console was developed, tested, and ready for release but never made it to store shelves despite being entirely finished. This lost game represented months of development work and significant financial investment that was simply abandoned when Sony decided to focus their marketing efforts on the PC and Mac versions of the interactive movie experience. The Sega CD, also known as the Mega CD in some international markets, was Sega's attempt to compete with emerging CD-ROM technology in the early to mid-1990s. The system was designed to handle full-motion video games and interactive movies, making it a perfect platform for the Johnny Mnemonic adaptation, which relied heavily on video sequences and branching storylines that took advantage of the CD format's increased storage capacity compared to traditional cartridges. Development teams had successfully adapted the PC version of the game to work with the Sega CD's hardware specifications, creating what was reportedly a fully functional and polished gaming experience. The conversion process involved optimizing the video compression, adjusting the interface to work with Sega controllers, and ensuring that all the interactive elements functioned properly on the console system. Beta testing had been completed, and the game was essentially ready to be manufactured and distributed to retailers. However, Sony ultimately decided that the potential sales on the Sega CD platform wouldn't justify the manufacturing and marketing costs, particularly since the console had struggled to gain significant market share against its competitors. The completed game was shelved indefinitely, leaving Sega CD owners without access to the Johnny Mnemonic experience. Years later, the finished game files eventually leaked onto the internet, allowing dedicated fans and video game preservationists to finally experience this lost piece of gaming history that had been sitting in corporate archives for decades. The Japanese version has extra Takeshi Kitano scenes. Japanese audiences who saw Johnny Mnemonic in theaters experienced a significantly different version of the film that included 3 extended scenes featuring Takeshi Kitano's character Takahashi, scenes that were completely absent from the American and international releases. These additional sequences were created specifically because Kitano was an enormously popular entertainer, director, and actor in Japan, making his presence in the film a major selling point for Japanese moviegoers who knew him from his comedy shows, dramatic films, and television appearances. The most emotionally powerful of these exclusive scenes shows Takahashi sitting alone in what appears to be his deceased daughter's bedroom, watching a 3-dimensional hologram of the young girl playing and laughing. This haunting sequence provides crucial backstory that explains Takahashi's motivations throughout the film, revealing that his ruthless pursuit of the data in Johnny's brain is driven by personal grief and loss, rather than simple corporate greed or power hunger. A second extended scene depicts Takahashi watching old videotapes of his daughter while self-medicating, presumably to deal with the pain of her death. This moment shows a vulnerable side of the character that international audiences never got to see, transforming him from a standard corporate villain into a complex figure whose actions stem from tragedy and desperation. The third additional scene involves Takahashi killing 2 of Shinji's henchmen as punishment for bringing them under his command without permission, demonstrating his authority within the organization while also showing his capacity for sudden violence. These scenes fundamentally changed the character arc and emotional weight of Takahashi's role in the story. making the Japanese version a substantially different viewing experience. The longer Japanese cut ran 103 minutes compared to the 96-minute international version, and also featured a different musical score composed by Michael Dana rather than the Brad Fiedel score used in other countries. Robert Longo was a famous visual artist. Before Johnny Mnemonic became his one and only venture into feature filmmaking, Robert Longo had already established himself as one of the most influential visual artists of the 1980s, creating works that would become iconic representations of that decade's cultural anxieties and urban tensions. His most famous creation was a series called Men in the Cities, which featured large-scale charcoal and graphite drawings of sharply dressed business people captured in moments of apparent physical or emotional distress, their bodies contorted as if they were being shot or experiencing some kind of violent impact. These striking black and white images were designed to be viewed in sequence, creating a narrative flow that anticipated Longo's later interest in cinema and moving images. The Men in the Cities series became so culturally significant that one of the images was used as the cover art for Glenn Branca's influential album, The Ascension, connecting Longo to the experimental music scene that was flourishing in New York during the same period. Longo's artistic background placed him within an elite circle of contemporary artists who were exploring themes of technology, urban alienation, and corporate power that would later become central to his interpretation of William Gibson's cyberpunk fiction. He had relationships with other major figures in the art world, including photographer Cindy Sherman and musicians like Rhys Chatham, positioning him at the intersection of visual art, experimental music, and emerging media technologies. Before taking on Johnny Mnemonic, Longo had transitioned from static art into moving images by directing music videos for major bands, including New Order's Bizarre Love Triangle and R.E.M's The One I Love. These projects allowed him to experiment with cinematic techniques while working on a smaller scale than feature films. However, Johnny Mnemonic represented his first and ultimately final attempt at creating a full-length theatrical movie, making it a unique artifact of what happens when the contemporary art world collides with Hollywood filmmaking. The Pinball Machine outlasted the movie's reputation. While the Johnny Mnemonic movie became a box office disappointment and critical punching bag, The Pinball Machine, based on the film, has enjoyed a remarkably different fate, becoming a beloved classic among pinball enthusiasts and collectors who appreciate its innovative design and thrilling gameplay. The machine was created by George Gomez, one of the most respected pinball designers in the industry, and released by Williams Electronic Games in August of 1995, just a few months after the film hit theaters. Despite being tied to a movie that performed poorly with both critics and audiences, the Johnny Mnemonic pinball machine developed its own reputation based purely on the quality of its mechanical features and game design. The machine introduced several unique elements that had never been seen before in pinball, including a player-controlled magnetic glove that could grab and manipulate the ball on the playfield, creating an entirely new type of interactive experience that went beyond traditional flippers and bumpers. The game also featured a sophisticated cybermatrix ball lock system that allowed players to strategically place balls in different positions to maximize their scoring potential during multi-ball sequences. These innovative mechanics, combined with the machine's extremely fast-paced gameplay and challenging rule set, created an experience that pinball players found genuinely exciting, regardless of their feelings about the source material. Over the years, the Johnny Mnemonic pinball machine has gained significant recognition within the pinball community, earning a spot in the prestigious Pinside Pinball Top 100 ranking based on player reviews and ratings. The machine currently holds a rating of 7.8 out of 10 from hundreds of players who have experienced its unique gameplay firsthand. Williams produced 2,756 units of the machine, making it relatively rare and sought after by collectors who appreciate both its historical significance and its entertaining gameplay mechanics. Keanu's room service rant reflected directors' frustration. One of the most memorable and memed moments in Johnny Mnemonic occurs when Keanu Reeves delivers an explosive rant while standing on a pile of garbage, screaming about wanting room service, club sandwiches, cold Mexican beer, and $10,000 a night escorts. What audiences didn't realize at the time was that this over-the-top outburst was actually director Robert Longo channeling his own deep frustration with the Hollywood studio system through his main character's breakdown. The scene takes place when Johnny reaches his emotional breaking point after being hunted by multiple factions and facing the possibility that his brain will literally explode from data overload. Johnny's desperate cry for luxury and comfort represents his longing to return to his previous life of corporate comfort and high-end amenities, but Longo has revealed that the speech was really about his own feelings during the troubled production process. Longo was experiencing intense pressure from Sony executives who were constantly interfering with his artistic vision and forcing him to make changes that he felt compromised the integrity of his cyberpunk adaptation. The director's frustration with studio demands, budget constraints, and commercial expectations found its way into Johnny's manic rant about wanting the finer things in life, creating a moment where the character's desperation mirrored the filmmaker's own sense of being trapped in an impossible situation. The scene also serves as a deliberate reference to Longo's famous Men in the Cities artwork from the 1980s, which featured sharply dressed business people caught in moments of apparent physical or emotional distress. Johnny's dramatic breakdown, with his arms outstretched and his body language expressing complete anguish, visually echoes the contorted figures that Longo had drawn years earlier. This connection transforms what might seem like an absurd moment of overacting into a carefully planned artistic statement that bridges Longo's previous work with his cinematic debut. Longo created a black and white director's cut in 2021. 26 years after Johnny Mnemonic's disappointing theatrical release, director Robert Longo finally got the opportunity to present his cyberpunk film in a format that more closely matched his original artistic vision by creating a completely desaturated black and white version that premiered at film festivals in 2021. This monochrome edition represents Longo's attempt to reclaim his work from the commercial compromises that had transformed his intended art house project into a mainstream action movie. Longo had always envisioned Johnny Mnemonic as a black and white film inspired by classic science fiction cinema like Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville and Chris Marker's La Jetée, movies that achieved their futuristic atmosphere through stark visual contrasts and minimalist aesthetics rather than expensive color effects and elaborate production design. The director worked with colorist Cyrus Stowe to carefully grade each scene, removing all color information while preserving the visual impact and emotional tone of the original footage. The black and white treatment fundamentally changes the viewing experience, making the expensive special effects and elaborate sets appear more dreamlike and artistic while reducing the emphasis on the costly visual elements that had driven up the production budget. Longo has described how the monochrome version makes the film look like it could have been made for the original $1.5 million budget he had initially proposed, effectively stripping away the commercial gloss that Sony had insisted upon. This alternative cut premiered at both the Tribeca Film Festival and the Rockaway Film Festival, giving audiences their first chance to see Johnny Mnemonic as Longo had originally intended it to be experienced. The director has expressed satisfaction with this version, explaining that removing the color makes the computer graphics sequences more coherent and gives the entire film a cohesive visual style that better serves the cyberpunk themes and philosophical questions that Gibson had embedded in his original story.